Well, in that case, hello, everyone. My name is P.S. Berkey. My pronouns are they, them. I'm at the University of Central Florida, where it is currently a charming 5 in the morning. So please forgive my waking brain. It is so good to be here on this panel. My talk today is Let All Partake in the Suffering, MÖRK BORG as a visual material toolkit for fan remix. I'm excited to talk about a unique tabletop role-playing game and its emerging zine culture. So first up, a really quick background on this case study. MÖRK BORG is a Swedish post-apocalyptic artpunk tabletop role-playing game, or TRPG. The game was written by Pelle Nielsen, illustrated and designed by Johan Nohr, translated into English by Patrick Stewart, not that Patrick Stewart, and published by Free League. And for context, MÖRK BORG means dark fort in Swedish. The game operates in the OSR, or old school revival tradition of dungeon crawler tabletop games. It's also been described as light on rules, heavy everything else. It's a relatively small book with only 16 pages actually containing rules. And thematically, MÖRK BORG draws from death metal influences and leans into a grim apocalypse rife with doomsayers, flesh alchemists, and the violent church of the two-headed basilisks. And the last thing you need to know about MÖRK BORG is that it has spawned an incredibly active zine culture of third-party designers, which will be my focus today. So here's our treacherous path ahead. I argue that MÖRK BORG extends existing scholarship on crap games and zine culture, reimagining the Xerox paperback TRPG movements of the 70s and 90s. So we're going to delve into MÖRK BORG's fandom, and I argue that the fandom itself is highly structured. Not only are there many creators, but crucial actors that I call catalyzers and canonizers who are driving community activity. Now, in game studies, we often discuss modding in fan games in the context of engines and code, but I want to look at how MÖRK BORG as a visual and material artifact is inherently hackable. And I will show how the visual material design of the game actively encourages fan remix through fonts, palettes, and art styles, and how these are reflected in third-party titles. And finally, I'm going to provide some design takeaways for game makers and some lingering thoughts for other TRPG scholars. So MÖRK BORG is actually an evolution of a tiny dungeon crawler by Pelle Nielsen called Dark Fort, which features the staples of OSR games: randomized generic dungeons, light rules, and kind of brutal gameplay. And OSR, again, refers to the old school revival, a movement about recreating the Xerox paperback format of early fantasy RPGs, especially original and advanced Dungeons & Dragons. But as Evan Torner points out, the OSR scene emerged out of the RPG site, a right-wing platform defined by its antagonism toward other indie TRPG spaces. And now, as tabletop role-playing games are going mainstream and becoming more inclusive, we are watching TRPG communities, and OSR in particular, reckon with the racist, misogynist, queerphobic, and conservative roots of the hobby. And the contentious legacy of the OSR scene was quite recently brought to the spotlight. In June of 2021, ENnie Gygax, son of the father of D&D himself, made transphobic comments in an interview, lamenting that we're not going to get back to the diamond that was Dungeons & Dragons. And in the weeks that followed Gygax's comments, the racist, queerphobic underbelly of the old school tabletop scene reared its ugly head, with an OSR game calling a trans woman disgusting on Twitter, and Gygax's company TSR starting #KeepGamingFantasy as a nod to the American far right. And this moment highlighted a contention within the larger TRPG community about the toxic origins of the hobby. But MÖRK BORG is an aesthetic, mechanical, and political reimagining of Dark Fort and the OSR genre writ large. And the book features colorful pages with glossy foil inverted crosses, a glow-in-the-dark spine, and a stark use of color and punky doodles, all marking a huge departure from paperback dungeons. MÖRK BORG actively remixes its OSR roots, and you can take this spread as an example, where we see the rules for character abilities placed on a small paper white box with punched holes reminiscent of old school note card characters, while the backdrop is a neoclassical oil painting of a biblical scene of mass flooding. And juxtaposing these registers of ephemera and canon kind of combines artful and playful. We might also look at the game weapons table, which spends an entire page of the rules teaching us that a femur bone deals 1d4 of damage, eschewing the OSR's usual value of page efficiency. At the same time here, the text is broken up into 6 different fonts, including Comic Sans and pink calling code, layering the information over hyper-violent illustrations. And this haptic layering extends to the book's material interactions. Players are instructed to choose their character backstories by throwing a knife at the page of options. And even more dramatic is the instructions for players to burn the book when they unlock the 7th in-game prophecy. So Morkborg deliberately obfuscates, denies, and reimagines its OSR roots by doodling over and burning them. And this is where my real interest lies. Although the OSR genre is associated with gatekeeping newcomers and shunning diversity, Morkborg has managed to open the proverbial hell gates to newcomers. And in the last year and a half, Morkborg's fan culture has exploded. They've successfully funded numerous follow-up Kickstarters and a cyberpunk spin-off game called Cyborg. But most notably, fan designers publishing their own Morkborg content have defined the game. And last January, the Morkborg Twitter account that announced that over 1,000 third-party Morkborg titles had been published. Now, Anthropy offers this idea of games as zines, as transmissions of ideas and culture from person to person, as personal artifacts instead of impersonal creations by teams of 45 artists and 15 programmers. And Morkborg fans pull from the old school trends of zine culture, haphazard, print-on-demand, and crowd-funded materials circulating their content on Kickstarter, itch.io, and DriveThruRPG. And they gather and support one another on Discord, Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit. And while scholars have noted the role of fan-made content, zines, modules, podcasts, and actual plays, less attention has been paid to what factors and affordances encourage the creation and circulation of fan TRPG content. And so my article seeks to complicate this relationship between fan creator and what Savonen and Stenrose have called the text, the book itself, by showing how Morkborg's sourcebook defies expectations of canon and materially equips creators with visual and textual design tools. So I'm using a framework that I theorized with Rebecca Britt in a recent Game Studies article on the Fire Emblem Three Houses shipper fandom. I approach fan creators by exploring 3 key layers of the community. Creators who design, draw, write, craft, and make the things themselves, producing the content in the network. Catalyzers who organize, equip, and encourage creators, often by coordinating events and providing resources. And canonizers who anthologize, publish, signal boost, and curate the content in the network. So with that cursory overview, we're going to take a deep delve into the haunted crypts of the Morkborg fandom. So Morkborg offers fan creators 2 modes of engaging with the IP and publishing their work. And the first is through the Morkborg Cult, a sub-label which accepts written submissions for production in semi-official zines with the layout and art done by the Morkborg team. But due to high volume, submissions to the cult have been closed for ages. And so instead, most third-party content is published through the second route, which is the third-party license. This is the first way that Morkborg anticipates and enables fan remix. The generous third-party license allows anyone to make content for the game with no cut to the Morkborg folks, so long as the designer includes some copy-paste ready legal disclaimers. The role of catalyzers is filled by community members hosting game jams and building design primers and guides. Jam organizers in the Morkborg community encourage reckless participation by providing few rules, absurd prompts, short deadlines, and devaluing ratings and competition. These jams are, as Anthropy says, about doing, not planning. For example, the Bad Basilisk MÖRK BORG jam, hosted by Rugos Khan, required submissions to incorporate an image of a religious children's maze into their spreads, and entries were evaluated based on such categories as Morky Borginess, Metaltude, or TPK ability, or how likely the title was to kill all the players. And these ranking categories emphasize the sacrilegious values of the community and their open defiance of best practices in game and graphic design. In another example, the Folklore Game Jam selected its winners in the Morky Borgiest way possible. Johann Knorr throwing a knife at his barn to select the winner. And Rugos Khan also awarded a special community prize to the game chosen most favoritist by an 8-year-old. In each case, contributors were encouraged to submit because everyone had a knife's throw chance of winning, no matter how skilled their design prowess was. And these actors also reinforced the political values of the community. Each of these game jams included a statement against hegemonic themes inspired by the MÖRK BORG website. This isn't a part of the license, yet jam organizers were careful to include it anyway. Remember, make it dark, depressing, weird, and cruel, but let everyone partake in the suffering. Be sure to avoid sexist, racist, homophobic, and transphobic tropes and themes in your content. And finally, the role of canonizers is complicated because the MÖRK BORG community is largely uninterested in determining what is official or what is even necessarily good. Instead, MÖRK BORG zine community seems to care more about the creation of content than its quality. And the MÖRK BORG Twitter account even stated in a Twitter debate that the canon is uncanonical. In fact, what lines divide official and canon is deliberately blurred within the community. And if you don't believe me, 2 of these zines are fan-made, and 1 is official. Can you tell which is which? The answer is the zine on the right is MÖRK BORG Heretic, an official zine of community-gathered projects, but you could only distinguish it via the Stockholm Cartel and occult logos. The other 2 covers look startlingly on brand because Johann Knorr, the designer for MÖRK BORG, often donates his own art to fan-made projects. So both Kevin Rahman's Forbidden Psalm and Chris Bissett's Treasures of the Troll King are fan-made Kickstarter projects with official MÖRK BORG covers. And all of this is made more complicated when Johann Knorr submits his own entries to fan-run jams. Is this canon? Who cares? And there are other key curators in the network here. Nor in the MÖRK BORG Twitter handle, retweet independent titles, and zine organizers compile submissions from the community, and sites like mörkborgcompatible.com track active and forthcoming Kickstarters so that community members can support and keep tabs on what's coming next. And this is what I call the everything counts approach. Rather than wading through everything to find the best content, they are hell-bent on documenting everything. And nothing is more demonstrative of this than one single example, which is truly extraordinary, and that is Ex Libris MÖRK BORG, an edited bibliography of thousands of third-party and official resources. Ex Libris is a curated, tagged, searchable index of all published third-party content made for MÖRK BORG, and entries are sorted into categories with curational notes and links to the profiles and storefronts where they may be purchased. Ex Libris's team of curators, such as Cannibal curator Ian Long, tweet regularly with events like Flail Fridays, highlighting new and outstanding contributions in each week's roundup of content. And they're even working to develop Ex Libris into an open source platform for other TRPG fandoms. It's no shock then that the MÖRK BORG Twitter account even went so far as to call Ex Libris one of the most important body parts of the shambling ghoul warrior that is MÖRK BORG. So let's talk about hackability. MÖRK BORG's aesthetic meshings are more than stylistic. They serve as a low barrier toolkit that is easily remixed by fans. And fan-made content will show you this. In general, fan-made content for MÖRK BORG tends to include indulging typographic deviance, including mashups of grim and cutesy tones, as well as public domain and original art. And 3, they maintain a strict palette, especially focusing in on pinks and yellows. And in another game design piece, these qualities would be seen as markers of poor design, undeveloped or novice practices, and used to gatekeep creators, but not here. So to start, let's talk type. The MÖRK BORG sourcebook includes over 100 different typefaces, and the community has adopted this typography obsession. The MÖRK BORG Discord features an entire channel where fan creators discuss graphic design and typography, and the fan-maintained MÖRK BORG design primer even includes long lists of typefaces broken down into legible and nor. And this use of illegible, exaggerated, and mismatched fonts and typefaces is a staple of fan creations. A perfect example of this title is New Year Studios' The Anti-Paladin Toolkit. You can just look at the fonts here. It's absurd. On the left-hand spread alone, there are over 20 distinct typefaces, vertical text, black on yellow writing, and small print. But remember, this is rewarded by the community. Carl Druid's 24-hour misery jam, for example, included in the jam thumbnail 4 different fonts, including Comic Sans, and awarded designers a point for every font that they included in their submission. In other TRPG design spaces, fonts used by sourcebooks are proprietary or require expensive licenses, but a vast majority of MÖRK BORG's 100+ fonts are free and available in the public domain. And while using pink Comic Sans might get you quickly evicted from another creative community, MÖRK BORG fan creators actively encourage such textual visual experimentation. MÖRK BORG content is also defined by blending cutesy and doomful tones, letting the cute and the terrifying juxtapose and exaggerate each other, and granting tonal flexibility to fan creations. For example, Duckborg is a supplement that reframes MÖRK BORG rules around humanoid ducks in the vein of Disney's DuckTales, and Kennels of Carnage was a game about rescuing dogs that included terrifying but adorable mashups of dog love and death metal. And the community engages in further graphical mashups by blending photos and drawn elements. While Nora's punky doodles have a distinct style, amateur artists can create their own harsh sketching that easily fall within the purview of the game's aesthetics. The community is certainly a doodle-friendly place. But perhaps most importantly, MÖRK BORG's use of classical art enables fan creators to use public domain images without fear of copyright retribution. While frowned upon in other design spaces, MÖRK BORG actively embraces stock images from sites like Pexels, Unsplash, and oldbookillustrations.com. Like the MÖRK BORG sourcebook, these fan creations recolor, doodle the top, and remix these stock images to new contexts. And finally, let's talk about the game's most distinguishing feature, the palette. The palette that undergirds MÖRK BORG is perhaps the most essential piece of its role as a material toolkit. The game relies predominantly on 6 colors, occasional reds, blacks, whites, grays, and most importantly, pink and yellow. And while pink and yellow are an odd choice for a gloomy post-apocalypse game, graphic design software like InDesign offers default color tools in CMYK, meaning designers can easily alter the magenta and yellow values of objects without precisely blending colors. And while fans have identified the specific pink and yellow from the original game and made them available in design primers, these colors are relatively close to what a novice designer would get from turning the magenta or yellow slider all the way to 100. And as Lazarus's punishment fist dog of the rotten gods playfully demonstrates, making a MÖRK BORG creation can be as simple as coloring something pink and yellow and calling it a monster. And this accessible palette also means that MÖRK BORG entries on Kickstarter and itch.io are often recognizable on site for their signature use of yellows, blacks, and pinks. So I want to wrap up with the proverbial corpse loot of this presentation. This case study shows that zine media is as much about the practices of the community as it is the tools themselves. And these practices have established MÖRK BORG zine culture as a kind of gateway into TRPG design. We might compare this, if I can be so bold, to the standards of another mainstream TRPG marketplace, the Dungeon Masters Guild. Here we see a market meritocracy bureaucracy that is all about following strict rules and patterns. All of the titles here rely on proprietary fonts, commissioned original artwork in a fantasy realist painted art style. There's no stock graphics here. And third-party publishers for D&D must master extensive licensing, style, and content guidelines in order to publish their work. Unlike the DMG, MÖRK BORG zine culture is primarily concerned with attracting newcomers and embracing its everything counts mentality. MÖRK BORG zine culture rewards crap game design, celebrating games based on a criteria like how holier than thou or yellow and or difficult to read they are. And this idea of a gateway game is one I really want to emphasize. Many of the creators I've showcased here got into RPG design through MÖRK BORG. For example, I went through the itch profiles of all 43 designers who submitted to Carl Druid's 24-hour Misery Jam, and I found that 77% had never published TRPG content on itch before prior to the jam, and 86% went on to release multiple MÖRK BORG titles, with several even going on to design for games besides MÖRK BORG, Pathfinder, Troika, Blades in the Dark, and even their own systems. So for designers who are looking to learn from this, here's the quick bones worth stealing if you're trying to inspire your own inclusive zine culture. 1 is legally anticipating and encouraging third-party design. 2, foregrounding inclusive values. 3, and I can't emphasize this one enough, supporting catalyzers and canonizers. And 4, including imitable graphic design features. And so to finally wrap up here in one last lung squeeze, MÖRK BORG has become a lightning rod for fan creation that is actively inclusive at a time of gatekeeping in the larger TRPG and OSR scenes. Rather than enshrining the rulebook and gatekeeping newcomers, the MÖRK BORG fandom focuses on fan-made content and burns the rulebook. And while this portrait of the TRPG creator scene and MÖRK BORG itself is narrow, it's my hope that this study can encourage further considerations of the relationship between the urtext and fan communities in game spaces, and more explorations of what makes analog games hackable. How might new games anticipate and encourage user remix? And how might they encode usable tools for fan creators into their materiality? And most importantly, how might we find and build new player designer communities that resist the legacies of hegemonic play? Thank you all so much. I know I went a tiny bit over what I was hoping, so I'm sorry, but I'm super available to talk about any and all of this on Twitter. So, DM me if you like.